My name is Joanna Bryson, and I'm Professor of Ethics and Technology at the Hertie School. I have a PhD in Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence from MIT. I have also degrees from Chicago and Edinburgh, but I've been doing mostly policy in the last few years. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what is artificial intelligence and how does that relate to ethics. All right, so first of all, let's talk about what is AI. Artificial intelligence is a special case of intelligence. So what is intelligence? There's actually, people will tell you, like, no one knows what it is, but in fact, that's sort of not understanding how definitions work. There's been a perfectly good definition of intelligence for over 100 years now, which is about being able to do the best thing you can in the current context. So recognizing a context and being able to adjust your action to that context. All right? So that's a pretty simple, straightforward definition, and I love it for a couple of reasons. First of all, it makes the clear point that we're talking about a relative measure. It's not that you're either intelligent or you aren't. It's not the machine suddenly became intelligent. It's that some things are more intelligent than others. So, you know, plants are a little intelligent. They can detect which way the sun is and they can grow towards the sun, right? Animals are more intelligent than plants. And it doesn't mean that if something becomes more intelligent, it becomes more human-like. It's just like saying that if something becomes taller, it doesn't become more giraffe-like, right? So intelligence is just one of those things. Okay, so that's one thing that's important. The other thing is it makes it clear that intelligence isn't something that's sort of magic or supernatural. It's a process. It's a process that we call computation. You're taking information about the current context and transforming that into an action. So an action, doing that transformation, doing computation, it's a physical process. It takes time, it takes space, and it takes energy. So it takes resources. That's why you have to plug your computer in, right? But it's the same for us. It takes us time to think of good ideas. All right, so, I should add on to that. There are physical laws about how much you can know because of those resource constraints. So it's just like anything else. There's laws of nature, laws of computation. One thing that when we think about what is an intelligent agent, we can think of it as what computer scientists call mapping. So for each different kind of intelligent agent, like every different kind of animal, every different person has a different idea of how to go from one context into another action. So that's called a mapping. And actually, we're a little more complicated than that. We don't have a single mapping because when we learn things, we change our map, right? But that's, again, a really important idea. It's not that you can understand everything. You're never going to have a perfect model of the entire universe. You're never going to have all the data. But what you don't want that anyway. Like I just mentioned, you want to be able to update your actions. You want to be able to come up with better solutions. And so for that reason, we have abstractions. We take all the information that we've perceived so far and everything that was already provided in our DNA and all these other places, and we come up with a prediction about what's the best thing to do now and go into the future. What is it to be artificially intelligent? It just means that somebody built you for a purpose, okay? So artificial intelligence is the subset of all the things like I just described that people built, right, or corporations. Okay, going back to that part about the abstraction, there's a problem. It's called the map of Germany problem. So the map of Germany problem is that a perfect map of Germany would be as big as Germany, and it would be of no use, right? You may as well just use Germany then, right? So we never want to have perfect maps. We never want to have perfect models. We always want to have these abstractions. Those are the things we can use. Now, the problems, a lot of the problems people consider to be AI problems, like AI bias, come from this process of abstraction, all right? So this is an experiment. It was a very well-known experiment in psychology that showed that people have implicit biases. So if you have words that are women's names and men's names, these are typically American women's and men's names, and you have words that are associated with careers and words that are associated with families. It should be, if the world was totally fair, equally easy to pair up names of women and careers and men with families as the other way around, right? But as you might guess, it's actually faster. It's much faster for people if they can put women and domestic names together and and men's and career words together. So, and that's this number down here, the D, is actually saying that there's a standard deviation. So really, there's an enormous separation between how fast you can do these two tasks. Now, the interesting thing here is that this D, there's two of them there, and that's because one of these is with humans having to push buttons for these two categories. They get two buttons, they have to choose one, which one do they put the two pairs into. And the other is for artificial intelligence word embeddings. So word embeddings are very, very simple AI. It's basically a big spreadsheet where you just count where it is that words tend to occur together. But that's how we do things like web search. That's how we do things like machine translation. We just say, hey, a word means basically how it's used. And so Wittgenstein was right, and Quine was right. It turns out that's true, and we can use it for a lot of things. But it turns out, just like humans, we have implicit biases. Why? Because we use human-generated text to train up our ideas of what words mean. In fact, there's no other source of words than humans, right? It's how we communicate. Okay, so obviously artificial intelligence is it's an artifact of our society. It's something that we use to get over that hurdle of the computational problem I mentioned before, the resource constraints. We learn from each other, so therefore we don't have to do all our own computation. We can learn clever things from each other, and we use machine learning sometimes when we program AI. But when we use machine learning based on our own culture, we will get both the positives and the negatives of our own culture. However, once we do that, it's actually pretty cool, because now what we can do is we can go and we can compare those biases, those same biases that, the evil sexist biases, those are on the y-axis here, right? The up and down one, okay? The x-axis is the actual proportion of people who have some jobs. Oh, I didn't say, the dots are the names of jobs, okay? So the actual proportion of people holding those jobs who really are women, okay? And what you can see is there's a very high correlation. So what both implicit bias and AI bias, which is just another kind of implicit bias, are showing us is about our lived experience. And this is really an important thing that people have been arguing about for decades before we did this experiment with the AI. We were able to show the source of implicit bias is our lived experience. It actually is different to be a woman than to be a man in the world right now, and that shouldn't be surprising. The same applies to race, the same applies to age. So one of the things we've been able to show is that artificial intelligence, if we just turn on machine learning, isn't going to be any better than we are. Artificial intelligence is something we've deliberately built, and therefore we have to decide we are responsible for it, or someone is responsible for it. A company has built it, whoever we buy it from. If we buy artificial intelligence, we are responsible for who we sourced it from, and we have to be careful about how we operate it, but also the developers have responsibility. It's just like a car. If you have a car and there's a defect in the car, then that defect is the problem of the manufacturer. If you get drunk and drive it into a tree, that's your fault. So it's the same. Artificial intelligence is just another artifact. One of the important things here is some people believe that artificial intelligence is itself an entity that could be responsible. That isn't true. We can't hold the machines responsible in the way that we hold people responsible. Why? It's because machines aren't people. Artificial intelligence will have the same biases as people have. And the interesting thing here is that when people have those implicit biases, that doesn't mean that they're bad people. It doesn't even mean that they will behave in a prejudiced way. Okay? So there's a difference between bias, which is just sort of regularities that's out there. Stereotype is the kinds of biases we've decided we don't want to have anymore. So for example, we want women to be able to have careers now. All right? We want people of other races to be able to have just as good of lives as whatever the dominant and largest race is. Those are decisions we've made. They're not truths about the past. They're hopes we have for the future. Okay? So prejudice is acting on a stereotype. It's not paying attention to the present agreement. It's behaving like the past is okay, or something worse than the past is okay. And how do you avoid prejudicial behavior? This is a very nice example. I just grabbed it from Twitter, but it's Finnish, but the original version of this was done by my co-author, Eileen Kalliskan there. Anyway, so in Finnish, there's no difference between he and she, okay? So there's only one word, hein, right? Assuming that's how you pronounce Finnish. I'm terrible at Finnish. But what you see is depending on the other words, if you're trying to do machine translation, depending on the other words, like invests and laundry, the English translation is going to guess he or she based on how often they tend to see those genders associated with that task, okay? So we can all say, we know why this is happening, but we are not happy with it. We don't think it's good enough, okay? So we can say it's prejudiced to make this translation, okay? Even though we actually understand the machine is just showing the stereotypes derived from our culture. All right, so let's say we wanted to make a translator. What should we do? Some people are saying we should alter the way that the learning happens. We should take that machine learning and change it. I don't like that because it's not transparent. It's not easy for people to tell that the right thing has been done, okay? So what I'm going to suggest instead is, okay, we have this translator problem, and okay, we use machine learning, right? And we go from what is out in the language, and we generate what? We're going to generate bad outcomes. We knew that, right? So in fact, if we don't match human biases, then we know something went wrong. So this is something we can check. We can check that machine learning did what it was supposed to do. Now let's say we have another target, which is we've figured out what fair means. That's not easy, okay? We've decided what it should be doing. Then we can actually build some other process to connect those. So just like with humans, we aren't only our implicit knowledge, we're also our explicit decisions, we're lots of complicated things, right? We have lots of knowledge. You can do the same with AI. You can architect a system and you can say, I want to have that part explainable so that when a regulator comes, they can see that I didn't, I not only fixed the sexism, but I didn't also add in something like to steer it towards my favorite funder, right? Or to steer clicks onto my own website or something like that. Even if you use machine learning there, it's still okay. Because once again, we can say, okay, we know what your inputs are, we know what your outputs are, can we replicate that, right? Although it's a little bit harder to convince. So the point is this whole thing is the translator. It's not just one action of machine learning, okay? And that's something that we can build and we can regulate. So when we go to a bank and we say, did you do the right thing? We don't say, explain the synapses in the heads of your bankers. We say, show us your books. Show us how the money went. And so we can do the same thing for artificial intelligence, right? We can say, how did you build it? How did you train it? What was the architecture? Did you cyber secure it? Where did you get the software libraries from? Where did you get the data from? How do you know nobody interfered with it? Why did people make this change right here when the system went to maybe showing a few more of your own results? Whose choice was that, right? And this is actually not, that sounds like a lot of work. It's normal with digital. It's first of all, it's totally normal. Go and work for an automotive company or an aerospace company, but also it's easier with a digital system because you can capture that during the development process automatically, and that's what we do already with software engineering. So decades ago, we've been starting using things called revision control, and it's called development and operations, DevOps. It's a simple process which artificial intelligence companies are unfortunately not always using. So this is something that regulators can impose. It will actually help the companies because then they are more able to create a product that they can continue to support. But also, it's something that then can be we can go back and inspect and say, did you do good process? Did you do due diligence? So if you have something happen with your software that changes an election outcome or something, you can go back and say, we did all the best things we could at the time, and we didn't know, and you should get in less trouble than if, say, you'd been told 5 years earlier, no, you shouldn't sell that kind of data, and you sold it anyway. So these are the things we ought to be able to check, all right? But it will also help people with their development and for selling their product in the long term. All right, so there are other social impacts. Bias is not the only thing. And I just told you about how we can regulate, but don't think of that regulation only for bias, think of all other kinds of things. one of the things people talk about a lot is employment. People are worried about artificial intelligence taking jobs. It isn't the artificial intelligence that takes the jobs, it's people who decide whether to employ more people or not. So for example, let's say I as a programmer went out and wrote some code that made teachers twice as effective, okay? There's nothing in that sentence that says, do we have twice as good of schools or do we have half as many teachers, okay? So that is something that's a political decision. It's something that society has to come together with its government, with the action of unions, and decide how are we going to do that. The people who built this, who did this science, were looking at how unions help keep wages up. But what you see, this is America, you see the wages coming down only until about 1992 or so. This is only for jobs that are automatable. So the kinds of things you would expect that you'd be replaced by a robot for, okay? So I said, well, why is this only happening in the 80s and 90s? And the person who wrote the paper said, oh, well, we have a theory, we economists have a theory, there hasn't been much artificial intelligence since about 1993. No, there's been tons of AI and amazing progress, especially since smartphones, we got all that data about people, right? So that's not the answer. The real answer is that that's the period when there was an opening of the Chinese labor markets to American products, and so therefore Americans were competing with the Chinese, all right? There's a similar thing, I'm not going to show you a graph, but just I'm showing you the name of another paper. A similar thing has been found in Germany, which is that the time when the wages went down was when the wall came down, right? The Berlin Wall, the country was reunified, and suddenly companies could plausibly move their factories to the east where it was a lot cheaper. So it was a decade later that wages came down in Germany. So the basic message here is that machines don't take jobs, and also machines aren't the things that flatten the wages in themselves. But they do make it possible for more people to do more kinds of work. So this has been the kind of thing that's happened in the driving industry, for example. If you look at why are there so few truck drivers right now, why are people having trouble hiring them? It's because they don't pay them anything. They used to pay them a lot. Why? Because you had to be a large man, basically, somebody large and strong, and you had to be good with maps, you had to be good with bookkeeping and everything else. Now we have GPS, now we have power steering. Power steering is also intelligence by that definition I gave you back there. Not much, but a little, right? It helps somebody to steer without physically moving the wheels, right? So, and we have Excel spreadsheets. So now more people can drive, the salary goes down, nobody wants to do it. If we want to have human drivers, we have to raise the salary, right? So if we want to have good human drivers. And so this is the question. This is a social issue where you decide, do you want to have people with good jobs, or do you want to keep trying to figure out ways to constrain people and make them into kinds of slaves with your technology? That is a societal decision. This is another thing that we worry about when we worry about AI. It's inequality and political polarization. So a lot of people right now are blaming political polarization on social media because there's been an increase in social media since there's been mobile phones, and there's been an increase in political polarization. Actually going back to 1978, decades before mobile phones, decades before most people had access to the internet. Okay, what happened in 1978? Well, among other things, you see that the proportion, now this is again American numbers, I'm sorry about that, but we have data showing something similar happening in a lot of other countries too. But anyway, these are where it's most studied is America. And somewhere around 1978, among other things, we saw inequality climbing. Inequality here is being measured in the amount of money that the top one, what proportion of income is held by the top 1%. And so you can see right now, in 2010, actually it's worse now. It was up to about 20%. So it's similar to what was happening before World War I. And that's not a coincidence. Periods with high inequality and high political polarization also tend to be periods of great chaos. So the really interesting question is what happened over here, right? Why did this stuff ever come down? And basically there was enough of the American elite that said, okay, one world war and one financial crash, that's enough chaos for us. We're going to sign up and side with the proletariat. And so you had this long period of Democrats and the New Deal, and they brought down the inequality gradually. So you see the political problem had to be solved first, then the inequality problem was solved for a while, and then something changed. Somehow people lost political will to do both the redistribution. Personally, I think it's because they saw that the Soviet economy had plateaued and they thought, okay, we've won, Marx's dangerous idea is over. Anyway, it's disputed, but something happened in '78 and now we're coming back. So it isn't artificial intelligence itself that's probably the problem here. We think that what's going on is when you have a technology that reduces the cost of distance, it's natural to have fewer winners because more people are able to go buy the best thing or use the best thing in this case. So right now it's the digital revolution. Back then it was oil and it was telegraph. And yeah, oil, you might think, why oil? But it's cheaper to move around than coal was, okay? And railways, right? So there's all these innovations allowing people to pile up money. And what had to change was then the regulation and the tax. So I think that's what's going to have to change now. One of the things we did in 2019 was come up with an explanation, which nobody else had done before, about why these two things are correlated. And the idea is basically that as you suffer economic a downturn, if you're in danger of large losses, then you have to reduce your risk profile. And one way to do that is by working more with people that you know are like yourself. So even though there's an advantage to working with diverse people, there's a huge economic advantage, there's a bit of more risk. And so when you're really in danger, you might avoid that risk. Okay, so that was our paper from December. This is a paper that's just come out recently in I think it was the very end of June. And this is about what does that inequality look like right now, okay? Now some people had been saying that there's a new Cold War. It's not between the Soviet Union and the United States anymore, it's between the United States and China, all right? So we decided to actually look at real data about this. So what you're seeing here, again, we've got a XY axis. The y-axis is the number of patents that these different companies hold. And this is for every company with at least 2 patents in the WIPO database under one of the multiple things that you could consider to be AI. So it's just kind of a random sample, but that's random is good when you're doing science, okay? And then the x-axis down here is the market cap. Both of these are logged, so it's a log-log scale, all right? So what you see is, it's hard to eyeball this, so let me just show you what you really see. What you see is that Europe is not actually that different from China in terms of innovation, and actually the whole rest of the world is doing quite a lot of other stuff too. So it's not that, that there's only that there's 2 regions and Europe has to pick sides and they should stop regulating because they're causing problems. Actually what's going on is that there's this huge dominance and it's located in America and it's being allowed to get enormous amounts of market power. China is interestingly conflicted about whether they want to have anybody with that kind of power. We do see a couple other countries doing the similar thing, Korea, Japan, of these national champions, which there's a dispute because how much power do you want companies to have relative to governments? But anyway, the point here is that there's one place where almost all the technology is happening, but that's a place that has relatively open borders. Europe is actually producing more PhDs than any other region globally. And a lot of those people are staying here, but some of them are going to the west coast of America, working with people from all over the world. There isn't just a few people, from one country there. And then creating software in an under-regulated space where people can make massive salaries and have huge amounts of power, and then selling it to the rest of the world. So this narrative that what Europe is doing is, that we don't have any AI or that we're over-regulated is false. That Europe is producing lots of AI, and Europe is determining how to make their society more fair, and also we have now the higher social mobility and higher innovation. So to summarize, what have we learned? We've learned what intelligence is. We've learned it's a form of computation. It takes resources, it takes time, space, and energy, And so therefore, it will never be perfect. And then we've learned where bias comes from. The fact that we can't have a perfect model of the world, so we make an abstracted, compressed version, and then that will include regularities that have to do with our history, which isn't necessarily perfect. And then that affects not only us as intelligent animals, but also the machines that we build. So artificial intelligence is intelligence that someone's built and someone's responsible for, and we can enforce that as governments. So as governments, we can go in and see whether people followed the correct processes, providing that they kept the right records. If they didn't keep the right records, then that's also culpable. We can assume that they intended the worst. All right? And then we showed that there are social consequences to having this technology available, and that we have big regulatory challenges which different global regions are handling different. But the important thing here is that these are all choices. I'm not telling you who's right and who's wrong. I'm telling you that there's no necessary fact that just comes from the artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is an artifact, someone's built it, and we can choose our future.